My name is Claire Navarro. I am 41 years old, and until that Saturday morning, I still believed that no matter how complicated a family got, a mother's birthday was sacred ground. I was in the middle of folding laundry when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Not a call, not even a real message, just a text from my older brother Derek that said simply, "Mom doesn't want you there tonight. Don't come." I read it 3 times. Not because the words were hard to understand, because some part of me kept waiting for the next line, the one that explained it was a mistake, the one that said he was joking, the one that made it make sense. That line never came. I set the shirt I was holding down on the bed very slowly, the way you set something down when you are afraid that if you move too fast, you will break something you cannot put back together. And then I just stood there, in the middle of my bedroom, in the middle of an ordinary Saturday, while the entire architecture of my family rearranged itself around me into a shape I had always suspected but never wanted to name. But here is what they did not know. Here is what none of them had figured out yet. Not Derek, not my sister Vanessa, not my mother sitting somewhere in her house, probably eating her morning toast and pretending everything was fine. They thought that text would shrink me. They thought it would send me back into the place I had always returned to, quiet, accommodating, apologizing for taking up space. What it actually did was free me. And before that birthday dinner was over, they would begin to understand exactly what they had lost. But I need to take you back first, because this story did not start with a text message. It started the way most damage in families starts. Slowly, quietly. So gradually that by the time it became undeniable, everyone had already decided it was normal. My name is Claire Navarro, and I grew up in a mid-sized city in Central Florida. The kind of place where the summers never really end, and the neighborhoods all look the same from the outside. We lived in a beige house on a street full of beige houses, with a mango tree in the backyard that my father planted the year I was born. There were 4 of us kids. Derek was the oldest by 5 years, and had always carried himself like the crown prince of a small kingdom nobody else could see. Then Vanessa, 3 years older than me, sharp and beautiful and allergic to being wrong. Then me, and then my younger brother Marcus, who was 7 years behind me and had the gift of being young enough that the family had already calloused itself around the rest of us by the time he arrived. He got the softer version of everything. My mother, Patricia, was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it quieter without doing anything except standing there. She had a stillness about her that other people mistook for grace. What it actually was, I came to understand much later, was control. She never raised her voice. She never had to. She had a way of arranging silence, of withholding warmth so precisely that the people around her spent most of their energy trying to earn back the temperature of a room she had quietly lowered. My father, Raymond, was the counterweight. Loud where she was quiet, generous where she was measured, easy to love and easy to manipulate. He died of a heart attack when I was 26, and in the years since, I have come to understand that his presence was the one thing that kept the family's gravity from collapsing inward. When he died, everything tilted. Derek stepped into the vacancy like he had been waiting years for the promotion. I left Florida at 22 with a degree in graphic design and an understanding that I needed distance to breathe. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where I knew almost no one, and I built a life the way people do when they have no safety net to fall back on. One client at a time, one late night at a time. I started as a junior designer at a small agency, worked my way up, then left to build my own studio when I was 32. I called it Solstice Creative. It was just me for the first 2 years, then one assistant, then 3 employees, then a reputation in the local market for brand identity work that felt honest and alive rather than corporate and hollow. I was not rich, but I was mine. That distinction mattered more to me than I knew how to explain to my family, so I mostly stopped trying. I married a man named Gabriel when I was 34. He was a structural engineer with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor that made me feel safe in a way I had not known I was missing. We had a daughter, Lily, who was 5 years old the morning that text arrived. She had just started kindergarten and was at the age where everything was a discovery and everything was hilarious, and life had not yet taught her that some rooms would make her feel like she was not supposed to be in them. I wanted to keep it that way for as long as I possibly could. We had settled in Nashville permanently by then. We owned a small house near a park, nothing impressive by anyone else's standards, but full of the kind of detail and warmth that I poured into every space I occupied, because making a place feel like a home was the only language I had ever trusted completely. My family came to visit twice a year, and I drove back to Florida for holidays. This was the arrangement. It worked the way arrangements work when everyone is performing a version of closeness rather than living one. Derek had taken over my father's contracting business after he died and turned it into something considerably larger, a mid-sized construction company that built commercial properties across Central Florida. He wore his success the way certain men wear expensive watches, not to tell time, to make sure you noticed. He married a woman named Sandra, who smiled with her whole face and said almost nothing that was true. They had 2 sons who were being raised to believe that being a Navarro meant something specific, and what it meant was that you did not question Derek. Vanessa had stayed close to home too. She worked in real estate, handled residential listings in the better neighborhoods, and had a talent for making every conversation eventually circle back to herself. She and Derek had a rhythm that I had watched my whole life, the way water flows along the path of least resistance, always finding the route that serves them best. When they agreed on something, there was a particular quality to it, a combined weight, a family consensus that was not actually a consensus at all, but a decision that had already been made and was simply being announced. And my mother, Patricia, the woman whose birthday I had been told not to attend. I had spent years trying to understand my mother in the way that daughters do when they love someone who keeps them at arm's length. I had read books about emotional unavailability. I had sat in a therapist's office in Nashville and tried to trace the roots of my own anxiety back to the place they originated. My therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Holt, had once said to me, gently but without apology, that some parents love their children in proportion to how useful or uncomplicated those children make them feel. She did not say my mother was one of those parents. She did not have to. The trouble with my mother was not that she was cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to identify, easier to defend against. The trouble was that she was selective. She had warmth in her, real warmth, moments where she would hold your hand or remember something small you had said months earlier and bring it back in a way that felt like being truly seen. But those moments were rationed, and the rationing, I came to understand, was never random. It always tracked closely with whether you were behaving in a way that made her look good, or whether you were making choices that complicated her life, or whether you were asking for something she did not want to give. I complicated her life. That had been true from early on. Not because I was difficult in the way people mean when they use that word about women, not dramatic, not unreasonable, not prone to scenes, but because I asked questions, because I noticed things, because when something was wrong, I said so, gently at first, then more directly as I got older. And in our family, that was the category of sin that could never quite be forgiven. The real fracture had happened 2 years before that Saturday morning, though the cracks had been forming for much longer than that. My mother had decided to downsize. She was 68 years old, the house was too big for one person, and the idea made complete sense on the surface. What she also decided, without consulting me, was that the mango tree in the backyard, the tree my father had planted the year I was born, the tree that had been in every family photograph for 4 decades, should be removed. Derek had told her it was a liability, something about roots and the foundation. He had a contractor ready to take it down. My mother agreed, signed the paperwork, and that was that. I found out from Marcus, who texted me a photo of a chainsaw resting against the trunk with 2 men standing beside it, and I called my mother within the hour. I did not yell. I did not accuse her. I told her that tree meant something to me, that it was connected to Dad, that I wished she had mentioned it before making the decision so I could at least say goodbye to it in some way. That was all. That was the entire conversation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, "I don't need your permission to make decisions about my own home, Claire." And something shifted in me then. Because she was right. Technically, it was her home. But what she had done, what she did not say out loud but what hummed underneath every word, was that she had made the decision specifically without me because consulting me would have meant giving me a voice. And a voice was the one thing she did not want me to have. I told Gabriel about it that night, and he listened in the way he always did, which was fully, without interrupting, without immediately trying to fix it. When I finished, he said, "That tree was a relationship, Claire, not just a tree." He was right. And that was the moment I started paying attention in a different way. Over the following months, I noticed patterns I had always felt but never allowed myself to name. When family decisions were being made, whether it was a holiday gathering, a financial question after my mother's rehab for knee surgery, a question of who would drive her to a specialist in Tampa, I was never called. I was told, afterward, what had been decided. Derek arranged, Vanessa concurred, my mother approved, and then someone would text me the summary as if I were a distant relative who needed to be kept minimally informed, rather than a daughter who lived 600 miles away and would have gotten on a plane without hesitation if anyone had thought to ask. Except no one asked. Because asking me meant involving me. And involving me meant the possibility that I would say something they would have to actually contend with. The gift I had a habit of sending for my mother's birthdays was one of the things that, in retrospect, I should have paid closer attention to. I did not just buy her something. I designed something. Every year for the past 8 years, I had used my studio to create a custom gift. One year, it was a letterpress book of photographs I had curated and arranged, a visual history of her life, with handwritten captions in a font I had designed to echo my father's handwriting. One year, it was a painting commissioned from a local artist in Nashville, a landscape of the neighborhood where my parents had first met, rendered in oil. The year before the mango tree was cut down, I had spent 3 weeks designing a custom ceramic tile installation for her kitchen backsplash, shipped it in a crate, and paid to have it installed as a surprise while she was at my brother's house for Christmas. My mother always said thank you. That was never the issue. But she said it the way someone says thank you for a courtesy they did not request. The gifts were acknowledged, not absorbed. And I noticed that when she mentioned them to other people, They became simply something a daughter had given her, without weight, without origin, without any of the labor or love I had threaded into every piece. That was the first signal I had been ignoring for years. The work I put in was received as function, not feeling. But I kept going back, because I loved her, or because I loved the idea of a mother who could love me back without conditions. I am still not entirely sure which one it was. The birthday was a Saturday dinner in late October. My mother had turned 70, which Derek had decided warranted a celebration large enough to be the kind of thing people talked about. He booked a private room at a waterfront restaurant in Sarasota, the kind of place with candlelight and a sommelier and a prix menu that signaled wealth without having to announce it. He sent around the plan in a group chat, 40 guests, family, close friends of my mother's, a few of Derek's colleagues. 7 o'clock. I had already made arrangements. I had booked a flight from Nashville to Tampa 3 weeks earlier. I had arranged for Gabriel's mother to stay with Lily for the weekend. I had already bought my mother a gift, another custom piece, a small illustrated journal I had designed with her favorite poems from the years she used to read to us when we were young, paired with a note that had taken me 2 drafts to write because I wanted it to be honest and warm and exact. I had been looking forward to it, not in the naive way of someone who believes a party will repair a relationship, but in the way you look forward to the chance to stand in a room with the people who made you and feel, for one evening, like the distance between you can be covered. That was before Derek's text. Mom doesn't want you there tonight. Don't come. I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the ceiling. And the thing that surprised me, the thing I had not expected at all, was that my first emotion was not grief. It was recognition. Like something I had been arguing against in myself for years had finally been confirmed by an outside source. I texted Derek back, not with anger, not with pleading. I wrote, "Does she know you're texting this, or did you decide for her?" Then I set my phone face down and went to make coffee. I needed to be still. I needed to think clearly before I did anything else. The response came 8 minutes later. "She knows. We all agreed it would be better if you sat this one out. You always make things tense." I read the message, and then I read it again, because I wanted to make sure I was not misreading the shape of what had just happened. My family had sat down, as a group, and made a collective decision that I should be excluded from my own mother's birthday party. They had used the word "we." They had offered a reason. You always make things tense. I want you to understand something about that phrase, because it will come back later in ways they did not anticipate. You always make things tense, is what a family says about the person who refuses to pretend. It is what you say about the one who speaks up when something is wrong, who asks the question no one else is willing to ask, who does not laugh at the joke that demeans someone in the room. Tense is the word families use when they mean honest. And honest is the quality they claim to want right up until the moment it actually appears in the room. I put my phone in my jacket pocket and walked down the hallway and stood in Lily's empty room for a few minutes. She had left drawings on her little desk, crayon horses and stick figures with 2 large heads. Gabriel had stuck one of them to the wall with masking tape. I traced the edge of it with my fingernail and felt something settle in my chest. A quietness. Not peace exactly. Something more like the moment before a decision, when the noise finally stops and the truth becomes audible. I went back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and opened my laptop. But before I tell you what I did next, let me tell you what had been happening in the background for the past 6 months, because that part of the story is the part they thought I would never find out about. My mother had started the process of drafting an updated will after her knee surgery. This was not unusual for a woman her age after a health scare. What was unusual was that she had done it in consultation with Derek alone. Not Vanessa, not Marcus, not me, just Derek. Marcus had found out by accident because he had stopped by the house when the attorney was leaving, and the attorney had handed Derek a folder as he walked out. And Marcus, who was not as removed from family dynamics as he sometimes pretended, had noticed the label on the folder and texted me about it that same night. I had not said anything. Not because I did not care about what was in the will. I genuinely did not. Our family had no significant wealth to distribute. But because the secrecy itself was the telling part. It meant Derek was shaping something. It meant he was whispering in my mother's ear in ways none of the rest of us could hear. It meant the narrative being built about me in that house, whatever it was not something I was being given the chance to answer. I found out 2 months later, through a conversation with Marcus that he described as mentioning it because you probably already know, that the updated will included a provision about the family property in Citrus County, a small lake house my father had owned that had been sitting vacant for years. Derek had been managing it. Derek had also, I would later confirm through a property records search I did myself late one night on my laptop, placed a lien on it through his construction company for work he claimed to have done on the structure. Which meant that, when my mother died, whatever claim any of us had to that property would need to pass through Derek's financial interest first. He had made himself a creditor of his own mother's estate. That was the architecture behind the exclusion. That was what we all agreed actually meant. It meant Derek had decided, my mother had accepted, and Vanessa had nodded along, and together they had constructed a version of our family in which I was the disruptive element who needed to be managed rather than included. Because an included Claire meant a Claire who might ask questions about a property lien she was never supposed to know existed. When I understood that, I did not feel angry. I felt something colder and clearer than anger. I felt the floor of my assumptions fall away, all the way down, until I hit solid ground, and the solid ground was this. They had not shut me out because I made things tense. They had shut me out because I was capable of seeing what they were doing. I called Gabriel at work. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him everything in the order it had arrived: the text, Derek's response, the property lien, the will, the pattern I had been ignoring for years. He listened without speaking until I was finished. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" Not what do you think you should do, not what will make this easier at Christmas. What do you want? I told him. I told him clearly. And then I opened my laptop and got to work. The first thing I did was call my attorney. I had a general practice attorney in Nashville I had worked with for Solstice Creative over the years, a steady and pragmatic woman named Dana Cho, who had helped me incorporate my business and draft several client contracts. I walked her through the property situation as I understood it. She told me what I suspected, that a lien placed by a family member on a parent's property, particularly one that had not been disclosed to other beneficiaries, was the kind of thing probate courts looked at very carefully. She told me to document everything I knew, gather the property records, and stay quiet for now. Don't confront anyone yet, she said. Let them think you don't know. I closed the laptop and sat with that for a while. The idea of staying quiet went against something deep in me, but I understood the strategy. The moment I revealed what I knew, Derek would begin covering his tracks. If I waited, the paper trail remained intact. So I stayed quiet. I did not go to the birthday dinner, not because they told me not to, but because I chose not to. There is a difference. The second one belongs to me. I spent that Saturday evening at home. I cooked dinner. I called Lily and talked to her about her week and listened to her describe a dispute over a coloring book at school with the gravity of a UN negotiator. I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the back porch with Gabriel, and we did not talk about my family at all. We talked about a renovation project on the house we had been putting off. We talked about a trip to the Pacific Northwest we had been saying for 2 years we would take. We talked about Lily, who had recently announced she wanted to be a marine biologist, or possibly a princess, and was willing to negotiate. I did not cry that night. I had expected to, but crying would have required a loss, and what I was beginning to understand was that I had not lost anything. I had only seen clearly what had always been true. The first message came from Vanessa the next morning. You really couldn't put it aside for one night for Mom's sake? There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I had been uninvited. No recognition of how the evening had come to be. Just the reframing, smooth and immediate, the one I had seen deployed my entire life. The absence of accountability so practiced it had become reflexive. I did not respond. My mother called at noon. I let it ring. Then I sat for 20 minutes holding the phone, not because I did not know what to say, but because I was deciding whether to say it at all. When I called back, she answered before the first ring finished, which told me she had been waiting. She asked where I had been last night. I told her I had been home in Nashville, as I had been asked to be. There was a pause. She said she did not tell Derek to send that message. I asked her if she had asked him not to. She was quiet. I told her that silence was also an answer, and that I had learned to listen to it. She told me she had been hoping we could all come together, that it had been hard lately, that she was not getting younger, the kinds of sentences that were true on their surface and empty of the accountability they were dressed to look like. I asked her about the property, about the lien. I said it quietly and without accusation, just a direct question, the way I would ask a client whether they understood a contract term. The silence that followed was so long that I actually checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, she said, Derek has been the one handling all of that. And there it was, the pivot, the handoff, the gesture toward the person who had been managing the story while she benefited from the results. Derek has been handling all of that was her way of saying, I know exactly what he has been doing, and I have been allowing it, and I will not stop him because stopping him would require a kind of courage I do not have and have never had. I told her I understood. And I did. I understood everything now. I hung up and sat in the stillness of my kitchen for a long time. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink, falling across the countertop in a wide stripe, and I watched it move very slowly, the way light does when you are sitting still enough to notice it. Outside, I could hear a neighbor's dog and a car going by, and somewhere down the street, children playing, the ordinary texture of a Sunday. And inside me, something that had been wound tight for years was finally beginning to go slack. That afternoon, I called Marcus. He was the one member of my family I trusted more than the others. Not because he was blameless, he had his own habits of avoidance, but because he was honest enough to know it. He confirmed what I already knew and added details I had not expected. He told me the birthday dinner had been uncomfortable, that my absence had been harder to explain than Derek had planned. Several family friends had asked about me. One of my mother's oldest friends, a woman named Elaine who had known us since childhood, had apparently asked directly whether something was wrong because she had received the invitation and the invitation had listed me as one of the hosts. I had not known about that detail. Derek had listed me as a host on the invitation without telling me, and then uninvited me the day of the event. Let that sit with you for a moment. He had used my name to make the event look like a family effort, and then removed me before anyone could see it had ever been complicated. He had borrowed my legitimacy for the marketing and discarded me for the evening itself. If that tells you everything you need to know about Derek Navarro, then you have understood the story correctly. I thanked Marcus and told him I was fine. He asked if I was really fine or if I was doing the thing I always did, which was say I was fine while doing something quietly significant in the background. I laughed because he knew me. I told him that this time I was doing both simultaneously and that he should not worry about me. What I did not tell him yet was that I had already contacted Dana Cho again and that we had begun the process of formally documenting the property lien and its timeline, and the question of whether it had been disclosed to my mother's attorney at the time the will was drafted. I did not tell him that I had also started quietly archiving every text message, every group chat thread, every piece of documentation that established the pattern of exclusion and manipulation that my brother had been operating under the cover of family loyalty. I did not tell him that one of my clients in Nashville was a forensic accountant who had, over 2 years of working together, become someone I trusted completely, and that I had asked her, very carefully and very specifically, whether she would be willing to look at the financial structure of a family real estate situation. I did not tell him any of that. I just told him I loved him and that I would be in touch. In the weeks that followed, I kept my public life exactly as it had always been. I posted photos of Lily in her Halloween costume, a very serious dragon with glitter scales she had glued on herself. I posted a sunrise from the park near our house that I had captured on a morning run. I posted a short reel of a brand identity project we had just completed at Solstice Creative, a visual system for a restaurant group that I was genuinely proud of. Nothing dramatic, nothing pointed. Just the quiet, visible evidence of a woman living her actual life. That seemed to sting in ways I had not fully anticipated. Vanessa texted me twice about it, the second time with a message that said, "I don't know how you can act like everything's normal right now." I read it and thought, this is the same woman who said nothing when her brother used my name to host a party I was not allowed to attend. She had confused my peace with indifference. She did not yet understand that peace was, in fact, my loudest response. Derek called once, on a Thursday evening when I was putting Lily to bed. I saw his name on the screen and let it ring. He did not leave a voicemail. That told me something. People who are confident in their position leave voicemails. People who are uncertain of their footing go quiet when they are not answered. My mother, to her credit, kept calling. Once a week, sometimes twice. I answered some of them. Not because we were repairing anything quickly, we were not, but because she was my mother, and because I still believed in giving people the opportunity to surprise you. Most of the calls were surface level. How is Lily? How is Nashville? How is the studio? She never brought up the birthday, never brought up Derek, never mention the property. She spoke to me the way you speak to someone you love across a glass wall. I could hear her, she could hear me, but nothing was actually passing between us. And then the call that changed the shape of everything came not from my mother, but from Elaine. Elaine was 74 years old and had known my mother since they were both young women in their 20s, long before children and houses and all the definitions life accumulates around you. She had been at the birthday dinner. She had been the one who asked why I was not there. And apparently, after weeks of sitting with something that did not add up, she had found my phone number through a cousin who had stayed in touch with me, and she called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing design proofs. She apologized first for calling out of the blue. Then she told me she had been thinking about me since the dinner and that something had been bothering her. She said she had been a close friend of my family for 50 years, and she had watched us grow up, and she had seen things over the years that she had never said out loud because it was not her place. But at my age, she told me, I am running low on patience for things that are not my place when the right thing seems perfectly clear. She told me she had been the one who initially told my mother about a particular elder care attorney in Sarasota, the same attorney who had drawn up the updated will. She had recommended him highly. But she had also, in a follow-up conversation with my mother weeks later, mentioned, gently, that she hoped the will had been drafted with all the children's interests in mind. My mother had said something vague about Derek handling the details. Elaine had let it go. But after the birthday dinner, after noticing the strain and the questions and the way Derek had gone rigid every time someone mentioned my name, she had started paying closer attention. She told me she had spoken recently to the elder care attorney herself, not about my family specifically, but about the general subject of liens placed by family members on aging parents' properties. He had described a pattern he had seen many times in his career and the way it most commonly played out. And she had listened carefully and thought about my family the entire time. Claire, she said, I want you to know that your mother is a woman I love like a sister. And I also want you to know that she is not as passive as she lets people believe. Sometimes people let things happen because the alternative is confrontation. But sometimes they let things happen because they want the benefit without the fingerprints. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. Your mother is not as passive as she lets people believe. I had spent years constructing a story in which my mother was a woman shaped by the forces around her, pushed into corners by Derek's certainty and her own discomfort with conflict. That story had served me because it left open the possibility that she could change. That if I could just be patient enough and generous enough and present enough, she would one day choose me the way she always seemed to choose them. What Elaine was telling me, gently and out of genuine love, was that my mother made choices. She made them quietly, and she made them in ways that allowed her to maintain the image of the woman who was simply overwhelmed by a complicated family. But she made them. And the choice she had been making, repeatedly, for years, was to keep me outside the circle of trust while benefiting from the warmth I brought every time I returned to it. I went for a long walk that evening, alone, through the park near our house, while Gabriel stayed home with Lily. The leaves were fully turned in Nashville, deep orange and rust-colored, and they were coming down in slow spirals in the late afternoon wind. I walked until I had covered probably 3 miles without noticing the distance. I thought about my father, about the mango tree, about the way he used to call me Clarita when I was small, and it embarrassed me, the way only things you secretly love can embarrass you. I thought about the version of my family I had held on to for 20 years, like a photograph of something that might still be true if I could just find the right angle. I thought about what it costs to love people who give your love back to you with deductions. When I came back through our front door, Gabriel was in the kitchen and Lily was at the table doing homework, which she was doing with her tongue slightly out the way she always did when she was concentrating. She looked up at me and said, "Mama, do you know how many bones are in a shark?" And I said I did not. And she told me very seriously and precisely, and then went back to her worksheet. I leaned against the door frame and watched her for a moment, and felt something settle into the deepest part of me. Whatever I decided from this point forward, it would not be decided for me. It would not be the result of someone else's text message, or someone else's exclusion, or someone else's architecture of guilt and silence. It would be mine. And it would be in service of that small, serious person at the table who was going to grow up watching how her mother moved through the world. I told Gabriel that night what Elaine had told me. He listened. Then he asked the question he had asked before, the one that had become the compass between us. What do you want? I thought about it longer than I usually did, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. Finally, I said, I want to stop disappearing so everyone else can be comfortable. I want Lily to see what it looks like when someone chooses honesty over harmony. And I want to protect whatever is left of my father's memory from being quietly signed away. Gabriel nodded and said, Then let's do all three. Dana Cho had, in the weeks prior, put together a comprehensive picture of the lien Derek had placed on the Citrus County property. The timeline showed he had filed it 2 months before the updated will was drafted. The lien was structured as a contractor's lien for work performed, citing repairs and maintenance totaling a significant sum. When Dana cross-referenced it with publicly available permit records, she found that only a fraction of the work had required permits, and that the value claimed was substantially inflated relative to anything documentable. More significantly, she had discovered that the elder care attorney who drafted the updated will had been hired through a referral that originated with Derek's company. He had chosen the attorney who drew up his mother's will. Dana laid this out for me on a video call with the same unhurried precision I had come to rely on. She explained that none of this was necessarily illegal on its face, but that the combination of factors, undisclosed lien, attorney referral, exclusion of other beneficiaries from the planning process, represented a pattern that a probate court would find worth examining. She recommended a letter, drafted and signed by me as a beneficiary of the estate, formally requesting disclosure of all property-related encumbrances to all named heirs. The letter would be sent to my mother's attorney directly. It would not threaten anyone. It would not accuse anyone. It would simply make official and visible the question that Derek had been counting on no one thinking to ask. I approved the letter on a Thursday. It went out on a Friday. By the following Monday, Derek had called me twice. I answered the second call. He did not begin with any of the warmth he used when he wanted something from me. He was direct. He said the letter was aggressive and unnecessary, and that it was going to upset Mom, and that I should withdraw it. He said I was making a business transaction into something personal. I asked him when he had decided that a lien on our mother's property was a business transaction and not something personal. He told me I did not understand how property management worked. I told him I had been running a business for 9 years and that I understood how documentation worked, and that the documentation did not align with the claims. There was a pause. And in that pause I could hear, very clearly, the recalibration happening on his end. The shift from treating me as someone who would be managed to treating me as someone who had already done something he could not easily undo. He said we should talk in person. I told him I preferred to keep our communications in writing for now. He told me I was being dramatic. I told him that was the second time in a month someone in our family had used that word to describe a reasonable request for transparency, and that pattern was worth noticing. I heard him breathe out. Then he said, very quietly, "What do you actually want, Claire?" I told him what I wanted. I wanted the lien examined by a neutral party. I wanted the full cost documentation for the claimed work disclosed to all the heirs. I wanted to know that whatever our mother decided to do with the property, it was a decision she was making with full information and without financial pressure applied by someone who stood to benefit. I told him those were not extraordinary requests. I told him they were what any attorney would advise a beneficiary to request. He hung up. 2 days later, my mother called me. She did not open with hello. She said, "What have you done?" I took a breath and told her exactly what I had done and why. I told her about the timeline, about the lien, about the attorney connection. I told her I was not trying to take anything from her. I was trying to make sure no one was taking anything from her under the cover of helping her. The silence on her end was the longest I had ever experienced on a phone call with her. It stretched out to the point where I had to hold myself still against the urge to fill it. When she spoke, her voice was different. Not warmer exactly, but there was something stripped away from it, the polished distance she usually maintained. She sounded tired. She said, "I didn't know about the attorney. I thought Elaine had recommended him herself." I told her Elaine had recommended him in general terms, and that the specific referral had come through Derek's office. She was quiet again. Then she said something I had not prepared myself to hear. She said, "I haven't always been fair to you." I sat down on the edge of my desk. I had been pacing while we talked, and now I could not stand. She said it again, slightly differently. "I know I haven't always been fair. I know there were times when I let the easier thing happen instead of the right thing. With Derek, with the house, with you." She stopped. I could hear her breathing. She said, "I don't know how to fix all of it. I don't know if I can. But I want you to know I'm not asking you to disappear." That word, disappear. She had chosen it herself without knowing it was the one I had been living around for years. I told her I did not want to disappear. I told her I had never wanted to disappear. I had only wanted to be in the room. She started to cry, quietly, the way my mother cried, without surrendering to it, like she was determined to feel it and contain it at the same time. I did not cry. I stayed very still and let her have the feeling without trying to carry it for her the way I always had. Before we hung up, she asked if she could come to Nashville. Not for a holiday, not for a family occasion, just to come. To see Lily, to sit in my kitchen. I told her yes. I told her the door was open. I also told her, clearly and without apology, that the door being open did not mean the conversation about the property was closed. That what I had set in motion legally would continue because the issue of disclosure was about her protection as much as anything else. She accepted that. Not easily, but she accepted it. We said goodbye in a way that felt, for the first time, like it was actually a goodbye and not a performance of one. Derek's company produced documentation in the following weeks in response to Dana's formal request. The numbers had been revised downward considerably from the original lien amount. The revision was never explained, but it did not need to be. An unexplained reduction in a claimed debt tells its own story. The lien remained on the property, but at a significantly reduced value and under formal scrutiny, which meant it was no longer the hidden advantage it had been designed to be. Derek did not call me again for several months. Vanessa sent me a long email about family loyalty and the damage I was causing. It was almost identical in structure to every other message she had ever sent me in the wake of my refusing to comply with something. The same vocabulary, the same move from the personal to the principal and back again. The same conclusion that somehow, in every version of every conflict, I was the one introducing chaos into a system that had been perfectly stable before I began asking questions. I read it once and filed it in a folder I had labeled, with a dark, private humor that I did not share with anyone, reference material. My mother came to Nashville in December, 6 weeks after our phone call. She arrived on the Thursday evening on a direct flight from Tampa. Gabriel picked her up from the airport because I was finishing a client presentation, and he offered, before I could even think to suggest it. That was a thing I noticed. The way he moved through our life with a quiet steadiness that made space without making a point of it. She arrived in our kitchen looking smaller than she had the last time I had seen her, which had been at Christmas 2 years before. Not frail, just reduced. Like a house after the furniture has been rearranged, and you can suddenly see the actual dimensions of the room. She stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I looked at her. And in the space between us were all the things we had not said to each other over years, and all the things we had said that had not been quite honest, and all the versions of both of us that had existed and passed through rooms without ever touching. Lily appeared at my side, not knowing any of this, carrying a drawing she had made of a dolphin. She handed it to my mother without preamble and said, "I made this. You can keep it if you want." My mother took the drawing and looked at it, and her face changed in the way faces change when something undefended touches them. She said, "I would love to keep it." Lily nodded, satisfied, and ran back down the hallway, and my mother and I were left standing there, and something almost like tenderness moved through the room. We did not resolve everything in that visit. We were not going to. Years of careful omission do not dissolve over 3 days of shared meals and cautious conversation. But things were said that had not been said before. My mother told me more than she had ever told me about her own upbringing, about her father, who had been cold in ways that had shaped her vision of what a parent was supposed to feel and what they were supposed to show. She told me she had loved me in the ways she knew how. I told her I believed that. I told her I also needed her to understand that love given only when it was convenient was not the kind of love I was going to keep returning to at any cost. She listened. She did not argue. She said, quietly, "I'm learning that." I do not know what happens next between us. That is the honest answer. The future of that relationship is still being written, and it will depend entirely on what she chooses when the choice is between the comfortable arrangement with Derek and the harder, more honest thing. I cannot choose that for her. I can only remain exactly who I am and let her decide whether she wants to be in a room with that person. What I do know is this: I am not waiting anymore. I am not folding myself into a smaller shape so that the people who benefited from my silence can remain comfortable in the space my smallness created for them. I am running a studio I built from nothing. I have a husband who asked what I wanted instead of what I should do. I have a daughter who is currently conducting a very serious investigation into the skeletal structure of marine animals and who will, if I do anything right, grow up knowing that her voice belongs to her and that love is not something you earn by making yourself easier to ignore. I see my family differently now, not with hatred, not even with the particular bitterness I might have expected, more with the clear-eyed recognition of people I understand finally, at their actual dimensions, rather than the larger and kinder versions I had been maintaining in my imagination for decades. Derek is a man who confused control with care. Vanessa is a woman who chose safety so many times it became her whole personality. My mother is someone who loved imperfectly and allowed harm because the alternative was a discomfort she had never learned to bear. None of them are villains, but none of them were safe either. And the difference between villain and unsafe is not always comfort enough to stay. The birthday dinner they held without me has become, in the way these things become, a kind of marker in my life. A moment where a door I had been leaning against for years was finally, definitively, pushed open from the other side, and I found I was not on the threshold at all. I was already somewhere else entirely, already standing in the middle of the life I had been quietly building, while everyone else was so certain I would return. There is a photograph on my desk at the studio. It is a picture Gabriel took the Christmas before last of me and Lily in the kitchen making cookies. Lily has flour on her chin and is looking at me with an expression of complete and unironic delight. I am laughing at something. I do not remember what. But what I notice every time I look at it is how unguarded my face is, how fully in the moment I am, how absent is the particular tension that used to live in my shoulders and around my eyes, the constant low-level bracing for the next adjustment, the next diminishment, the next version of myself I was going to be asked to offer up. That tension is gone. Not because the family conflict is resolved, not because my mother has changed overnight, or Derek has had a revelation, or Vanessa has discovered a capacity for honesty that she has never before demonstrated. The tension is gone because I stopped making my peace contingent on their participation. Some people will want to know whether it was worth it, whether the legal process, the difficult conversations, the distance, the boundary I drew around my own life was worth the cost of the relationships it strained. I understand that question. I used to ask it about myself constantly, measuring every decision against the damage it might do to a version of family I kept hoping would eventually arrive. But I no longer think worth it is the right framework. Worth it implies a transaction, something gained in exchange for something spent. This was not a transaction. This was a recognition. The recognition that a life built around the approval of people who profit from your uncertainty is not a life. It is a performance. And I had been performing it for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. What it feels like is this. It feels like waking up without the weight. It feels like Lily's voice in the hallway first thing in the morning before the day has complicated itself. It feels like Gabriel handing me a cup of coffee without being asked because he noticed I had not gotten to it yet. It feels like sitting at my desk at Solstice Creative and looking at the work we produce and feeling, without qualification or asterisk, that it is good, that it is honest, that it is mine. My father planted a mango tree the year I was born. They cut it down without telling me because they could. But trees have root systems that go deeper than what is visible above the ground. And some things, once they have grown long enough in the right direction, cannot be undone simply by removing what you can see. I am my father's daughter, not in spite of the women I had to become to survive that family, because of it. And whatever comes next, whatever is still unresolved and still tender and still asking to be looked at directly, I am meeting it from a place they have no jurisdiction over, a place built entirely from the wreckage of everything they thought would stop me, a place I learned to build only after they taught me, finally and completely, that I could never depend on them to let me in. They told me not to come to my own mother's birthday, and what they handed me without knowing it was the last thing I needed to stop asking permission to exist. So I stopped, and I have not looked back since, and I do not intend to.